May 11, 2022, Arizona carried out its first execution in 8 years. A 66-year-old man named Clarence Dixon was strapped to a gurney and quietly injected with a lethal dose of drugs. No crowds, no last-minute appeals, no national headlines, just silence. But here's the part that made people uneasy, even angry. The crime he was punished for, it happened in 1978, 44 years ago. And during those 44 years, Clarence Dixon had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. He'd lived most of his life in a prison cell, completely disconnected from the world. So why, after all that time, did Arizona suddenly decide to bring back executions? Just to make him the first? Was it justice? Or revenge delayed for so long it had already lost its meaning? Her name was Dina Bowdoin. She was just 21 years old when she was taken. Dina was a student at Arizona State University, majoring in Spanish. She dreamed of becoming a teacher or maybe working overseas. Those who knew her said she had this quiet confidence. She didn't need attention, but when she spoke, people listened. She grew up in Tempe, Arizona, in a close-knit family. Her parents were proud of her. She was their only daughter. Dina had a passion for learning. She loved reading books in Spanish, even poetry. She kept a small collection of journals. Her handwriting was neat, thoughtful. On weekends, she liked visiting local coffee shops or going hiking with friends. She had a cat named Molly. And in the summer of '77, she traveled through Europe with a study abroad group. She came home glowing, full of stories, full of hope. Around that time, she started dating a young man she met on campus. They'd been together for almost a year. By all accounts, it was a good relationship, healthy, respectful, the kind of love that starts quietly and grows stronger with time. On January 6, 1978, Dina had dinner with her mother. They talked about school, her future, maybe planning a trip together later that year. That night, Dina returned to her apartment. It was a modest off-campus unit, just a 10-minute walk from campus. She called her boyfriend, told him she was home safe, that she'd see him the next day. But by morning, Dina wasn't answering the phone. Her boyfriend grew worried. He drove to her apartment and knocked on the door. No answer. He let himself in. What he found would haunt him for the rest of his life. Dina was lying on the bed. Her hands were tied with a man's belt. A scarf had been wrapped tightly around her neck. The room looked undisturbed, no sign of forced entry. Her belongings, books, jewelry, notes, all still in place. It looked like someone had walked in calm, deliberate, and left without a trace. Police arrived quickly, but they were left with more questions than answers. There were no fingerprints, no DNA testing in 1978, no surveillance cameras, and no clear motive. The case shocked the campus. Students were terrified, but after weeks, then months, then years, the investigation faded. Dina Bowdoin's name was filed under a long, painful category, cold case. The investigation into Dina Bowdoin's death began immediately. But from the very first day, detectives faced a frustrating reality. There were no obvious clues. Dina's apartment showed no signs of forced entry. The front door was locked, her bedroom window was shut, nothing was stolen, her wallet, her jewelry, even cash in plain sight untouched. This didn't look like a robbery, it looked personal. But nothing in Dina's life suggested she had enemies. Investigators looked at her boyfriend first, standard procedure. But his alibi checked out. He'd been cooperative, devastated. Her friends, professors, exes, all interviewed. None of them raised red flags. Then the medical examiner's report came back. Dina had been strangled with a scarf. There were signs of sexual assault. And the time of death was estimated just a few hours after she got home. Whoever did this likely followed her, or maybe he knew her. Detectives began knocking on doors around the apartment complex. Some residents said they heard muffled noises that night. One woman remembered hearing footsteps in the hallway around midnight, but nothing unusual. Others said they'd seen a suspicious man walking near the complex earlier that evening. A tall black man, possibly in his 20s or 30s, but the descriptions were vague. No one knew his name. A composite sketch was made based on those sightings. It was shared in the media but led nowhere. Weeks passed, then months. The leads dried up. The public moved on, and Dina's family was left with grief and silence, but the detectives, they never officially closed the case. Evidence was stored carefully. The belt used to tie her hands, the scarf, swabs from the autopsy, all preserved in cold storage. They didn't know it then, but this evidence, especially the biological samples, would one day become crucial. Still, in 1978, there was no such thing as DNA testing. The technology wouldn't exist for another 7 years, so for a long time there was nothing they could do. Dina's name was quietly added to a growing list of unsolved homicides, and for the next 20 years her file sat untouched. That is, until 2001. Arizona launched a cold case DNA initiative, using new technology to re-examine old evidence. Dozens of boxes were reopened, including Dina Bowdoin's. When scientists tested the preserved swabs, they found something: male DNA, a clear profile. It was uploaded into CODIS, the national DNA database, and almost instantly, there was a match. The DNA from Dina Bowdoin's case sat untouched for decades, but in 2001 technology caught up, and when that profile was uploaded into CODIS, the combined DNA index system, something extraordinary happened. A match appeared almost immediately. The DNA belonged to a man named Clarence Dixon. At first, detectives were confused. That name wasn't in any of their original notes. He wasn't a neighbor, not a student, in fact. No one involved in the case even remembered hearing his name. So who was Clarence Dixon? At the time of the match, Dixon was already behind bars. He was serving a life sentence in Arizona for a 1993 sexual assault conviction. But when investigators dug deeper, they discovered something chilling. Clarence Dixon had a long, troubled past. He was born in 1955, grew up in Arizona, and had a history of severe mental health issues. As a young man, he'd been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. He was in and out of institutions, struggled to keep jobs, and had several run-ins with the law. Then in 1977, just a year before Dina's murder, he was arrested for assaulting a woman with a metal pipe near the ASU campus, but incredibly, he was found not guilty by reason of insanity and released under supervision. And guess what? His release date, just a few weeks before Dina Bowdoin was killed. Suddenly, things started to make sense. Dixon had no known connection to Dina, but he lived within walking distance of her apartment. He often wandered the area at night, and the assault in '77, that victim had also been a young woman, alone, targeted. The pieces were falling into place. Detectives now had DNA linking him to the crime scene, and a disturbing pattern of violence that placed him in the right place at the right time. In 2002, Clarence Dixon was officially charged with first-degree murder in the case of Dina Bowdoin. The trial, however, wouldn't begin for another 6 years. Why the delay? Because Dixon's defense team raised serious concerns about his mental state. They argued that Dixon wasn't fit to stand trial, citing his schizophrenia diagnosis and erratic behavior. But after multiple psychological evaluations, the court ruled Dixon understood the charges. He could participate in his defense. The trial would move forward. In 2008, the courtroom finally opened its doors. Prosecutors laid out a clear case. They had DNA evidence, a history of similar violence, a timeline that aligned. Dixon's attorneys didn't deny the DNA was his. They couldn't. Instead, they focused on his mental illness and the fact that he'd already been in prison for life. But the jury wasn't swayed. After a short deliberation, they delivered their verdict. Clarence Dixon was found guilty of murder, and because of the aggravating factors, the sexual assault, the binding, and Dina's young age, he was sentenced to death. Clarence Dixon was sentenced to death in 2008, but his story wasn't over. In fact, it was far from finished. Like many death row cases in the United States, especially in Arizona, the path from sentencing to execution would be long, uncertain, and filled with appeals. Dixon was now an older man in his early 50s when the verdict came down, but his lawyers quickly filed a series of motions. They claimed his mental illness, specifically his schizophrenia, made him ineligible for execution under the U.S. Constitution. They cited the Eighth Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, and they weren't the only ones watching. Advocates for mental health rights, legal scholars, even some religious leaders argued that executing someone who had hallucinations and delusions would set a dangerous precedent. But there was another side to the debate. The Bowdoin family, especially Dina's sister and mother, had been waiting for justice since 1978, and as the years passed, they waited through silence, through one denied appeal after another, through delays, motions, evaluations. For them, justice had already taken too long. Meanwhile, Dixon spent his days alone in a small, concrete cell in the Florence State Prison. He rarely spoke. He often refused visits. Writings became rambling, disjointed, filled with legal jargon and religious references. One letter to the court claimed that his trial had never happened. Another said that God would soon return to judge mankind, not the courts. Still, the courts continued to evaluate his condition. And despite his mental health history, judges repeatedly ruled that Clarence Dixon understood his sentence. He may have been ill, but he was legally sane, and so the sentence remained death. For nearly 15 years, Dixon remained on death row. During that time, Arizona had halted executions entirely due to controversies over lethal injection drugs and botched procedures. But by 2021, the state signaled it was preparing to resume, and Clarence Dixon's name was first on the list. The Attorney General's office moved to set an execution date. The prison located a new supplier for the chemicals, and behind the scenes, preparations quietly began. In the media, there was only mild coverage, but in legal circles, the question was loud and unresolved. Should Arizona execute an elderly, mentally ill man for a crime that happened over 4 decades earlier, or was this finally time for justice? The courts made their decision. After multiple last-minute appeals, in April 2022, the Arizona Supreme Court issued a final order. Clarence Dixon would be executed by lethal injection in May 2022. After 44 years, the Dina Bowdoin case was finally reaching its end. It was May 11, 2022, a Wednesday. At Florence State Prison, the lights in the execution unit flickered on before sunrise. Clarence Dixon, now 66 years old, frail, with white hair and thick glasses, was awake. Prison staff offered him a last meal. He requested KFC, a strawberry milkshake, and a slice of cheesecake. He ate quietly, alone. Hours later, as the sun rose over the desert, a small group gathered outside the prison walls: protesters, journalists, and supporters of the Bowdoin family. Inside, everything was planned to the minute. At 9:30 a.m., Dixon was escorted to the execution chamber. He did not resist. Witnesses described him as calm, even detached. His arms were strapped down, Roman 4 lines inserted, and a heart monitor attached. Behind a pane of glass, a group of observers watched in silence. Among them, Dina Bowdoin's sister and a few reporters from local and national media. At 10:10 a.m., the warden asked if Dixon had any final words. He nodded and began speaking softly. His final words were, "Maybe I'll see you on the other side, Dina. I don't know you and I don't remember you. To the family, I'm sorry if this hurts, but I can't say sorry for something I don't remember doing." His voice faded. The drugs began to flow. First a sedative, then a drug to stop breathing, and finally one to stop the heart. Dixon blinked a few times. His chest rose and fell, then stillness. At 10:30 a.m., he was pronounced dead. Outside, prison officials read a brief statement, and the Bowdoin family released their own words, saying, "We have waited 44 years for this moment. We are not celebrating, but we are finally at peace." The state of Arizona had carried out its first execution in 8 years. For some, it marked a return to justice. For others, it reopened debates about mental illness and capital punishment. But for Dina's family, it was the end of a very long chapter. Clarence Dixon was gone, but the questions, they remained. Just hours after the execution, debates reignited across Arizona and beyond. Was justice truly served, or had the system failed someone again? Dixon's lawyers had long argued that he was not competent to be executed. Back in 1977, before Dina Bowdoin was even murdered, Dixon had been found not guilty by reason of insanity in another case. For decades, he had documented symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia, including hallucinations and delusions. He claimed prison staff were part of a conspiracy. He believed Dina's murder was part of a setup, and at times he even thought his lawyers were robots, but the courts ruled he was mentally competent enough to understand his punishment. That legally was all the system needed. The American Civil Liberties Union, a clue, and mental health advocates strongly disagreed. They called the execution a shameful act, saying that punishing a man with a lifelong mental illness like Dixon violated basic human rights. Others asked, why did it take over 40 years to close this case? Was that justice delayed or justice denied? Critics pointed to Arizona's inconsistent death penalty process. In fact, the state had paused all executions in 2014 after a botched lethal injection that took nearly 2 hours. Since then, protocols were revised, new drugs were secured, but many still doubted the system's ability to carry out executions humanely. On the other hand, some families like Dina Bowdoin's felt that the process took far too long. We waited decades, we aged with this pain, Dina's sister told reporters. He outlived both our parents. And we still had to fight for closure. Meanwhile, reporters questioned why Dixon wasn't caught sooner. He had been arrested many times after 1978, yet police never connected him to Dina's murder until 2001. It took a random DNA review over 2 decades later to make the match. If that DNA review had happened earlier, would Dixon have been caught before harming others? No one could say for sure. What was certain, though, was this: the Clarence Dixon case had become more than a story of justice. It was a story about time, about trauma, about how the system sometimes moves too slow and sometimes too blindly. For some, his death brought peace. For others, it opened wounds that might never fully heal. The story of Clarence Dixon didn't end with a lethal injection. It lives on in the questions he left behind and in the lives he forever changed. For Dina Bowdoin's family, this wasn't just about justice, it was about memory. Dina was young, full of potential, a language student, a traveler, a daughter, a sister. Her life was not defined by the way she died, but for 40 years her story was overshadowed by delays, trials, and appeals. It took 4 decades for her name to return to the headlines, 4 decades to say, we didn't forget her. But what about Clarence Dixon? Who was he really? A cold-blooded killer, or a mentally ill man failed by the system again and again? The truth perhaps lies somewhere in between. His past was full of red flags, violence, delusions, arrests, untreated psychosis. Yet no one stepped in, not seriously. His crime in 1977 resulted in a mental hospital stay. But within a short time, he was back on the streets. There was no tracking, no care, no follow-up. And in January 1978, a young woman named Dina paid the ultimate price. This isn't just a story about crime, it's a story about systems. Systems that miss signs, systems that take too long, systems that sometimes act too late. Arizona's forensic backlog delayed justice. The courts took decades to bring the case to closure. And Clarence Dixon, he became a symbol not of evil, but of how complicated justice can be. Should a man who hears voices be held fully accountable? Should someone who forgets their own crimes be put to death? And what happens when justice takes so long that both the killer and the victim seem like ghosts from another time? These are not easy questions. And maybe that's the point. The Dixon case challenges us to rethink what we mean by justice. Is it punishment or prevention? Is it about vengeance or understanding? In the end, all we know for certain is this: one life was stolen, one life was taken, and dozens more were caught in the ripples between. The Clarence Dixon case is now closed, but the lessons, they're still unfolding.